The town of Cardiff, New York, sat along the Onondaga Valley floor in the autumn of 1869, its fields already harvested, its creek beds running low after a dry summer. The air carried the particular cold of October in upstate New York, not yet winter but close enough that farmers worked quickly, pushing to finish whatever the season had left undone. It was on one of those mornings, the 3rd of October, that a laborer named Gideon Emmons drove his spade into the earth on William Newell's farm and struck something that was not stone, not root, not any buried thing a farmer expected to find. What came out of the ground was a man, or the shape of one, 10 feet, 4.5 inches from crown to heel, carved from a single block of gypsum, the surface stained the color of old bone. The figure lay on its back with one hand resting across its abdomen, its face turned slightly to one side, its expression arranged in the composed stillness of something that had been underground for a very long time. Workers and farmers who came to look at it over the following days would later say that standing at the edge of that pit and looking down felt like standing at the opening of a grave. Not because the thing was frightening, but because it felt specific. It felt like a burial. If you're finding this story compelling, hit the like button and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. It means a great deal to know who is paying attention. Within 72 hours, William Newell had erected a tent over the excavation site and was charging 25 cents a head to view the giant. Within a week, the price had doubled. Within a month, the Cardiff Giant had been seen by tens of thousands of people from across New York State, and newspapers as far away as Boston and Chicago were printing competing theories about what exactly had been pulled from the ground. Some argued it was a petrified man, a genuine human body turned to stone by the mineral-rich soil of the valley, a process that geologists of the period called petrifaction, and that the general public received as entirely plausible. Others argued it was a pre-Columbian artifact, a carved figure left by a civilization that had occupied the valley before any European records began. A smaller number, including several academic visitors from Yale and Cornell, argued from the first day that it was a fabrication, a carved stone planted deliberately to be found. The record does not preserve a consensus. What it preserves is the size of the crowd. By the time a syndicate of businessmen from Syracuse purchased a 3/4 interest in the giant for $30,000, a sum that in 1869 represented the cost of several modest homes, the object had already escaped the category of curiosity and entered something closer to myth. People were not simply paying to look at a large carved stone. They were paying to stand in the presence of a question about who had been here before them and how long the earth had been keeping its silence. There was a mortician in Syracuse named Amos Westcott. He did not purchase a share of the giant. He was not among the businessmen who gathered around Newell's dining table to sign papers and divide receipts. But Westcott was present at Cardiff in those first days, and what the record shows is that he arrived not as a curiosity seeker, but in a professional capacity. The Onondaga County Medical Establishment had sent several of its members to assess whether the figure was anatomically consistent with a human body, and Westcott, who had worked as an embalmer and undertaker in Syracuse since 1854, was considered among the most experienced preparers of human remains in the region. His notes from that visit survive in a partial form in the collection of the Onondaga Historical Association. They are written in the precise, stripped-down language of a man accustomed to recording the physical facts of bodies without sentiment: dimensions, surface conditions, material density, the angle of the limbs and the position of the hands. What they do not contain, and what the record has never satisfactorily explained, is any written conclusion. Westcott examined the giant for the better part of a morning. He took measurements, he made observations about the surface texture and the mineral composition of the material. He wrote down everything he observed. He never wrote down what he thought it was. The absence is the document. In a professional record that runs to 11 pages of careful notation, the space where Westcott's conclusion should appear is blank, not crossed out, not redacted, simply left empty, as though the sentence was begun and then abandoned, or as though the man who had prepared hundreds of bodies for burial looked at this one and decided that what he knew was not something he was prepared to commit to paper. To understand why that silence mattered, you have to understand what Amos Westcott knew that the crowds filing through Newell's tent did not. By 1869, Westcott had been preparing bodies for burial in central New York for 15 years. He had worked through the Civil War years, when the demand for embalming expanded rapidly as families sought to have their dead returned from distant battlefields in a condition that allowed for viewing and proper burial. He had trained under practitioners who had themselves trained under the first generation of American embalmers, men who had developed their techniques in the 1840s and 50s when the profession was new enough that its methods were still debated. What that training gave him was a precise and specific knowledge of how the human body changes after death, how tissue hardens, how bone yellows, how the body's dimensions shift with decomposition and with the particular chemistry of whatever soil surrounds it. He had seen bodies pulled from the ground after months, after years. He had prepared remains that had been buried for decades. He understood the relationship between mineral-rich soil and the preservation of organic material in a way that most of the geologists visiting Cardiff did not, because he had held that material in his hands. He also understood something else. He understood the difference between a body that had died in the earth and a body that had been placed in the earth. The position of the Cardiff Giant's hands, the angle of its neck, the way its weight was distributed across the excavation floor. These were the details that a man who had arranged hundreds of bodies for coffins and caskets would read differently than a geologist reading surface composition or a theologian reading divine significance. The giant's position was not the position of collapse, it was the position of arrangement. The Cardiff Giant measured 10 feet 4.5 inches, the longest verified human skeleton on record in the United States at that period, measured slightly under 7 feet. The anatomical proportions of the figure were broadly consistent with a human body scaled upward, the ratio of limb to torso, the placement of the features, the curvature of the spine in repose. But there were anomalies. The feet, several visitors noted, were carved with a precision that the rest of the body did not quite match, as though whoever had made the figure had spent more attention on that detail than on others. The surface showed tool marks in places, but only in places, and the tool marks that were visible were consistent with both careful carving and with the scarring that prolonged mineral exposure produces on soft stone. Westcott would have seen all of this. He was not looking for myth or for the confirmation of a belief he had arrived with. He was doing what he had been trained to do, reading a body for what it could tell him about how it came to be the way it was. And what the blank space in his notes suggests is that what he found there did not resolve cleanly into any of the categories his training had prepared him for. The giant was removed from Cardiff in November of 1869, transported to Syracuse and then to Albany for exhibition. It drew crowds everywhere it went. P.T. Barnum, who had been refused the opportunity to purchase the original, commissioned a plaster copy and exhibited it in New York City, publicly claiming that his version was the authentic artifact and the Cardiff original was the fraud. A reversal so audacious that it confused the public in exactly the way Barnum intended. By the time the hoax attribution began to solidify in the press, the figure had already been seen by a significant portion of the northeastern United States, and the question of what it was had been replaced in the public mind by the question of who had made it and why. Amos Westcott's notes were not widely circulated. They were not published in any medical journal of the period. They were retained in his personal files, passed to his son after his death in 1888, and donated to the Onondaga Historical Association in 1911, along with a collection of other professional papers. The donation record describes them as examination notes, Cardiff, October 1869, and nothing more. No archivist appears to have flagged them as significant. They sat in a folder for decades. What the notes preserve, beyond the measurements and the surface observations, is one line that appears near the end of the document, written in a different ink than the rest of the notation, as though added later. The line reads, "Prepared in a manner consistent with preparation for burial. By whom and for what purpose I cannot say." The official story of the Cardiff Giant was settled quickly, too quickly given what was actually known at the time. In December of 1869, a cigar maker from Binghamton named George Hull confessed that he had commissioned the figure 2 years earlier, contracting a stonecutter in Chicago named Edward Burgard to carve it from a block of gypsum quarried in Fort Dodge, Iowa. Hull claimed the inspiration came from an argument with a Methodist minister about a passage in Genesis describing men of great stature walking the earth before the flood. He said he spent $2,600 on the project, transported the finished figure by rail to Cardiff under a false manifest, and paid William Newell, his cousin, to bury it on the farm and hire workers to dig a well in the right location to find it. The press received this confession as a complete explanation. The story was closed. But the confession contained gaps that no newspaper in 1869 chose to examine. Hull named Burgard as the carver, but Burgard, when located and questioned, gave an account of the commission that differed from Hull's in several material details: the timeline, the number of men involved in the carving, and the destination Hull had originally described for the figure. Hull said the gypsum was shipped directly from Fort Dodge to Chicago. Freight records from the Chicago and Northwestern Railway for that period, examined by researchers at the State Historical Society of Iowa in the 1970s, show no manifest matching Hull's description of the shipment's weight, routing, or declared contents. The stone itself complicated the story further. Gypsum from the Fort Dodge deposit is a relatively soft material, rated at approximately 2 on the Mohs hardness scale. A figure carved from it and buried in moist soil for 2 years, the period Hull claimed it had been underground, would show specific patterns of surface degradation. The Onondaga soil is heavy with calcium carbonate and iron compounds. These minerals leave traceable deposits on submerged stone surfaces in a time frame that is measurable. Several geologists who examined the giant in the weeks after its discovery noted that the mineral accretion on the figure's surface was consistent with a burial period considerably longer than 2 years. Westcott noted the same thing. His examination records the mineral deposit depth on the figure's torso and lower limbs with the same clinical precision he applied to everything else. He does not interpret the measurement, he simply records it, and the number he records does not match a burial of 2 years. Hull's confession was taken at face value because it was convenient. A hoax was a story that could be told cleanly, printed in 2 column inches, and forgotten by the following week. The alternative, that the figure's provenance was genuinely unclear, that its surface told a different timeline than the one its supposed creator described, required a different kind of attention, the kind nobody was prepared to give it. If this investigation has your attention, subscribe and turn on notifications. There is more to uncover. Your support makes it possible to bring these buried histories to the surface. The Cardiff Giant passed through several owners after the Syracuse Syndicate sold it in 1870. It toured as a museum exhibit, appeared at county fairs, and eventually came to rest in the collection of an Iowa publisher named Gardner Cowles, who stored it in his basement for 30 years. In 1948, the Farmers Museum in Cooperstown, New York acquired it, where it remains today displayed in a low wooden structure near the museum's entrance, lying in the same position in which Gideon Emmons found it. The plaque beside it says, "Hoax." That word did the work that Hull's confession started. It collapsed the object into a single category and closed every question the object had opened. A hoax requires a hoaxer, a victim, and a revealed truth. Hull supplied all 3, and the press accepted the package without looking at what the wrapping concealed. What the wrapping concealed was Westcott's measurement. The mineral accretion depth he recorded on the figure's torso corresponds, by the deposit rates documented for Onondaga County soil, to a burial period of between 15 and 40 years, not 2. That range is wide because soil chemistry varies across a site, and because Westcott was not attempting to date the burial, he was simply recording what he observed. But the lower end of that range places the figure in the ground no later than 1854. The upper end places it there before 1830. George Hull was born in 1821. He would have been a child, or not yet born, when the lower end of Westcott's range suggests the figure entered the earth. Hull could not have commissioned a figure that was already buried before his confession's timeline begins. That contradiction was available to any journalist in 1869 who had read Westcott's notes and done the arithmetic. None did. The notes were not published. The measurement was not reported. The number sat in Westcott's folder, passed to his son, passed to the archive, and was examined seriously for the first time more than a century after the man who wrote it had died. The question the record leaves open is not whether Hull fabricated the giant. He may well have. The question is whether what he buried was something he had made or something he had found. A man building a hoax around a genuine artifact is a different story than a man building a hoax from scratch, and the physical evidence does not clearly distinguish between them. What it does is refuse to confirm the clean version. Westcott knew this. The final line of his notes, written in different ink added after the confession had already been published, does not revise his earlier observations. It does not say he was wrong, or that Hull's account explained what he had seen. It says only, "The measurement stands," 4 words at the bottom of a document that nobody read for 100 years, in the handwriting of a man who had prepared bodies for burial his entire adult life, and who, when he encountered something he could not place in any category he trusted, chose to record the fact and say nothing further. The Cardiff Giant still lies on its back in Cooperstown. The soil that stained it is still visible in the creases of the stone. The figure's hands are still arranged in the position Westcott described in October of 1869, not collapsed, not scattered, not the attitude of something that fell, the position of something that was laid down. Thank you for staying with this until the end. If what you heard here stayed with you, the other films on your screen continue the investigation. Subscribe if you haven't, and I will see you in the next one.